And in the red corner we have Jane Austen. And in the blue corner we have Thomas Hardy.
So, who's better, Austen or Hardy? So today I am going to be comparing, contrasting Jane Austen and Thomas Hardy. I am going to be looking at a specific book from each author, mainly because I have read one from each very recently, and so they're fresh in my mind. They haven't seeped out with other grey matter, and also I'm in the same emotional and literary maturity phase for both of these, if that makes sense. So I have read two novels previously by Jane Austen and one other by Thomas Hardy, but they were quite a while ago, and so I don't think it's fair to compare them. So the books I'm going to be comparing are Persuasion by Jane Austen and Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. So the way we're going to do this, the way I think we're going to do this is I have got 5 categories which I am going to rank or score from 1 to 10 for each of the novels, and then at the end we're going to see who has the most points and therefore which classic literary giant is the best. So let's just have a little background first, shall we? So Jane Austen wrote 8 novels. She did write some smaller novellas as well, but she wrote 8 main novels, or 8 pieces of work that can be considered a novel, and Persuasion was the last of those. It was published posthumously in 1817, and Persuasion follows a young girl called Anne who in her youth was persuaded not to marry the love of her life, and she regrets that she was persuaded to do that, and then the man that she rejected rocks up again in her life, and we see what happens. Persuasion is set across a few different places, but probably the main action of the book happens in either Lyme Regis or in Bath, and it's lots of stately homes and that sort of stuff. So that's sort of like the rough setup for Persuasion. Far from the Madding Crowd, on the other hand, by Thomas Hardy, was his 4th novel of 14. So he wrote a lot more than Jane Austen, but this was one of his earlier works as opposed to hers being her last. This book was published in 1874 and takes place, I'm not exactly sure where in the country, but I think it's West Country, in the UK, West Country, very much on farmland. We are based on a working farm, and that's sort of the setting for it. And in that book we are following Bathsheba, who is a young woman who inherits a farm, and she is quite sought after by some of the men in the rough vicinity, and it is about those men's approach to her and what she does with that. So the 5 categories that I'm going to mark these books against are setting / descriptive writing, characters, main character, plot and writing style. So let's get into it, shall we? So let's start with descriptive writing, description of setting. For Persuasion, I felt that the large stately homes, the feel of richness was well conveyed, and there were sections particularly when they were in Lyme Regis, where I thought it was well described, but in general I found it quite difficult to get a picture of where they were, and I felt like there wasn't as much description as I personally enjoy in a book. It felt that we were either discussing character or we were discussing plot, but we didn't really discuss setting very much in that book. Happy for you to disagree, but that was my personal opinion. And so because of that, I'm going to give Persuasion 6 out of 10 for this category. Then we have Far from the Madding Crowd, and Thomas Hardy is probably quite well known for his description of location, description of nature, and this was no exception. So we very much saw the forests and the farm and the weather, and it was all really, really well described in Hardy's work. I would say pretty much every chapter began with a descriptive section so that you could really place your mind where the characters were, and that worked beautifully for me. I can see why some people may consider that too waffly, but it was just the right amount of description for me. There are other authors, I think, that are a lot more waffly with their place descriptions, and yeah, this was pretty much spot on for me, so this gets 9 out of 10. So then we're going to look at characters, and as I said, we're going to look at characters and we're going to look at main characters separately. So this is really about supporting characters, the characters around the main character. And so in Persuasion, we have Anne's family, and particularly her father and her sisters were very, very comical, like deliciously comical. They were ridiculous people. We also had Captain Wentworth, who was the man that she didn't marry at the beginning of the book, and his family. So there were lots of different characters surrounding Anne. Most of them were ridiculous, and I felt like they were all quite similar. So all of the ridiculous characters were ridiculous, and there wasn't really anything much to tell between them. And the same for Wentworth's side of the family. They were all relatively pragmatic, nice people, but nothing really that stood out in their personalities that made them different from each other. So though I did enjoy a lot of the banter, I felt that it was a little bit 2D for me, and so 8 out of 10 is what I'm giving this, because they were funny. They were funny characters and I really enjoyed them, but they needed a little bit more nuance in my mind. And then we go to Far From the Madding Crowd, and in this there are a lot of peripheral characters, but predominantly there are the 3 main love interests of Bathsheba and her maid are probably the main surrounding characters, and they were all so different. Gabriel Oak is probably the first one that we meet, and he is sort of steadfast, and he is the one that you root for from the beginning, and Thomas Hardy makes you believe that in his character. And then you have Boldwood and you have Troy, and both of those are very, very different characters, and I think they are very well written. There are a lot of shades of grey in both of those characters, and I really appreciate that in a character description. And the maid character, Liddy, was sort of a little bit on the ridiculous side, so akin to Jane Austen's characters, but toned down a lot. Very, very much toned it down. There were some other characters in the book, but I probably won't mention them. One of them would be a bit spoilery. So there's 2 things. Firstly, I think Hardy did a better job at differentiating his characters, and I also think that his character style was more to my taste. So for that, he gets 9 out of 10 for characters. Main character. So in Persuasion, we have the lovely Anne, and she is absolutely a character that you can root for from the beginning. She is steadfast, she is sensible, she generally makes the right decisions, except this one decision that she was persuaded against. And she's quite feminist in a lot of ways, and it's lovely to read that in a book that was written in the 1800s. So yeah, she was fab. She was very contrasted with the other characters in the book, I think, which lends itself to you appreciating her even more, and so 9 out of 10 for Anne. And then we have Bathsheba, who is similar in some ways but also very, very different. So Bathsheba again is at the beginning of the book, she's quite sensible, she takes control of her life, she inherits this farm and she takes over, and she is doing a brilliant job of being independent, a strong independent woman, but she makes some stupid decisions in the book. There's no polite way to put it. She's stupid in this book, but I did believe that she would make those stupid decisions, and so we sort of see quite a big character arc for Bathsheba. And I think because we see that change in her, and it's not necessarily growth, which is what we usually expect to see in a book, a character learning and improving on themselves, she almost goes the complete opposite way. And so because of that, she gets a 10 out of 10, because she was just more interesting to read, because you didn't quite know what she was going to do next, whereas Anne was quite predictable. So both excellent female leads, but Bathsheba wins it just by a smidge for me. So plotty plot. Persuasion. Persuasion is at its heart a romance, and therefore, if you know my reading tastes, it almost loses a point just for that. I don't mind if romance is part of a plot, but I don't like it to be the sole focus, and it absolutely was in this book. It was all about Anne's relationship with Captain Wentworth and what happened in the past and what happened going forwards. And there was very little subplot, there was very little outside of their relationship. That was the main focus all the way through. And so, though it was nice, it was easy to follow, it was just a bit too simplistic in my mind. So 5 out of 10 for plots, for persuasion. That could get me kicked off booktube, I realise. Sauce. And then on the other hand, we have Far from the Madding Crowd, which is definitely a more convoluted story because we are seeing things from multiple perspectives. So we see things from the perspective of Bathsheba, and we see things from the perspective of all three suitors, and also from another character. And so I think when I started reading this, because I started reading Far from the Madding Crowd as a buddy read, but I fell way behind. So I was reading this with Emily at Novell Novels, and right at the beginning I said, oh, I didn't realise this was going to be like multi-perspective, because we do switch from Bathsheba's life to another character's life. And I was like, oh, okay. And that all sort of ties in at the end. So we sort of have all these different strands coming in. And I think just because there was so much more to it, and there were threads that were coming in even towards the end, that I was like, oh, and it just kept me guessing really all the way through. That's the sign of a better plot. However, it did meander in places. As classics I want to do. So 8 out of 10. And then we look at writing style. And though these are both classic authors that wrote within sort of an 80-year period of each other, they have very, very different writing styles. I found that Jane Austen had a very comical, almost slapstick approach to her writing. She liked to tie in lots of family links, which I sometimes found difficult to follow, and I understand a lot of people have said that she is better on a reread because you can pick up on some of the smaller details that you wouldn't pick up on a first read because you're trying to follow what the hell is going on. So there's that, which maybe is a positive in some people's books and maybe it's a negative in other people's books, but generally she did have a beautiful style that you can follow all the way through, and as I say, it was pretty comical. So I would say 8 out of 10 for writing style for Austen. And then we move to Hardy, and his writing style is very different because, as I sort of discussed earlier, he puts quite a lot more descriptive writing in his work. He also, I was talking about this in the persuasion group, but he does have comedy in his writing, but Hardy is very much dry, sarcastic comedy, so you may not pick up on it. It's definitely not slapstick in the same way that Austen is, but it's this undertone of snark in quite a lot of the book, which I very much appreciated. It's definitely my sort of humour, and yeah, really appreciated that. And as I said, he creates the characters in a different way. He is more about showing than telling. The characters are put into situations where you can see how they react, whereas I felt it was told to us a bit more in Austen what these characters were like. It's just how my interpretation of it is. And so 9 out of 10 for Hardy on writing style. And so scores on the doors. We have Austen coming in at 36 points out of 50, and Hardy coming in with a whacking great 45 out of 50. And so I think we can safely assume that Hardy is my favourite writer of the two when we compare these two books. Obviously, if it was a different two books, maybe I would have a different opinion, but generally, looking at the sort of general writing style of both authors, Hardy is definitely more my jam. So have you read both of these authors? And if you have, please let me know in the comments which one you preferred. And I hope to see you all very soon with another one. Bye guys.